4-1 favourite she is now with the tote, 4-1 with the William Hill organisation, and the William Hill organisation also go 2-1 the Dick Hearn stable, because of course it can be represented by several more fillies. So real hard luck this for the connections of Devonshire, Miss Gina Elliott and Jack Can, all the way from Devon, to see her slip up on the turn. 5-1 on this height of fashion, this filly we're seeing now, having maintained her unbeaten record after an eventful 11th running of the Loopy Stakes, as we can confirm with Julian.
Well, this is the worst turn on the racecourse, and I was saying earlier we've had a bit of drizzle here, and quite simply this filly in front, Devonshire, or not in front, in second place, has slipped up. And one thing that this does show is that Height of Fashion can jump, because she is right in the path of the Queen's filly, and look how she has jumped over Devonshire. She simply had to get away with it, and somehow or other has emerged from that unscathed. You can see that she's lost 6 lengths. Luckily, jockey Brian Rice was back on his feet soon, and Devonshire doesn't seem to be too seriously hurt. But you can now see that the Royal filly is 6 lengths adrift, and she's taken her time to pull that back. In fact, just for a moment it looked as though there was going to be another Royal sensation, shades of 1957 and the Doncaster Cup, because at this point Ernie Johnson seemed to be holding the Royal #1 on Round Tower. But Willie has worked and worked and pushed, and to be fair to this filly, it must not only have given her a shock, it must also have taken her concentration off the job in hand. But she doesn't seem to me to have acted really well on the course, and I'm bound to say it won't come as any surprise if she's redirected to the Prix de Diane. She's gone there in the end. Now she's galloping on a fairly level terrain, and in fact a bit of uphill. She's put 2 or 3 lengths between herself and the second, but it wasn't quite the run that Connections were looking for.
Henry Porchester, Lord Porchester, Her Majesty's racing manager, with Willie Carson, and of course the debate now will be whether this filly is to go to Chantilly or whether she's to run in the Oaks. No question in my mind that Epsom would be the place, because it's 1.5 miles, and 1 mile 2.5 furlongs at Chantilly. I can't see not being too sharp for her. But as I was saying earlier, what very bad luck on the West Country Challengers, a little sporting stable, mostly more renowned for jumpers, and who would have thought that they'd have a faller on the level today. Jack Can, there he is consoling Gina Elliott, his owner, and Brian Rouse, his stable jockey to Ron Price. Ron walking back with his stable jockey, and what a season it's been for Ron. He broke a foot earlier on, and it looked as though he was really going to be in trouble there. He had a very unhappy experience last week when poor Baronet broke down and had to be put down yesterday. And so here they are coming to the turn, with Round Tower leading and Devonshire going well in the second place, when the poor girl loses her footing altogether. And not only Height of Fashion, but Willie Carson show great nimbleness there. Willie, of course, used to the hunting field, and sticks with this filly like a limpet as she avoids her prostrate rival. And Brown very, very lucky to not to catch one of those flying hooves as well. And what a nice sight to see that filly get up, Devonshire, and to see her canter down the course, apparently none the worse, particularly after that so sad happening yesterday when Pearl's Diamond, the little 2-year-old filly, broke her shoulder and then had to be put down. And so, with Height of Fashion, winner of the 11th running of the Loopy Stakes, the starting prices and results at Goodwood to date as follows.
First, number 1, Height of Fashion, 5-1 on favourite. Second, number 4, Round Tower, 50-1. And third, number 5, Tetra Rose, 33-1. First, Height of Fashion, 5-1 on favourite. Second, Round Tower, 50-1. And third, Tetra Rose, 33-1. Jackpot number 401 and 4 rand. Here are the Goodwood results today. The 2 o'clock, won by number 2, Brackadale, 8-1. Second, number 1, Old Dominion, 4-1. And third, number 3, Piancourt, 9-2. Winter at £1.18. The places 25, 16 and 14 pence. Straight forecast £4 and 3 pence, and the dual forecast £1 and a penny. 2:30, first number 21, Mainsail, 5-2. Second number 19, Love Tangle, 7-4 favourite. And third number 12, Gay Patricia, 14-1. Win tote 39 pence. Places 23, 13 and 19 pence. Straight forecast 71 pence. Dual forecast 55 pence. 3 o'clock, first number 4, Fandangle, 5-1. Second number 6, Molan Lave, 5-2 favourite. And third number 5, 10th of October, 20-1. The win tote 64 pence. The places now 12, 17 and 45 pence. Computer straight forecast £1.72 and the dual forecast 62 pence. And the 3:30 at Perth, first number 1, Rage Glen, 11-10 favourite. Second number 3, Bold Raider, 6-4. And third number 4, Witchin, 7-1, 4 runners.
Well, after that dramatic and sensational race for the Loopy Stakes, Major Dick Hearn has made no decision yet, nor indeed has Her Majesty's racing manager, prior to consultation, as to whether this filly will run in the Epsom Oaks or go to Chantilly for the Prix de Dia. And as Peter was saying, that is over a furlong and a half left. Obviously, Chantilly, you would think, would, in terms of the physiognomy of the course, would suit the filly better, but probably the distance of the Epsom Oaks might suit better. So that is a decision to be made. Well, I also have an unconfirmed report that Golden Fleece worked this morning and is A-OK and back on the Epsom Trail, but I repeat that that is unconfirmed. Well, no racing on Trading Grandstand this Saturday. It is, of course, Cup final day, Spurs versus Queen's Park Rangers. I thought the value there was 40-1 about QPR to be winning at half-time and Spurs to be winning at full-time. I see that's dropped to 25-1. Our next racing, in fact, will be at Haydock Park on Saturday week, when the big race is the Cecil Frail Stakes, supported by the Gus Demi Stakes. Well, I hope you enjoyed our informative 3 days racing at Goodwood. We saw a very, very good horse yesterday in Peacetime winning the predominant stakes, and a very good filly, although whether she turns out to be an Oaks filly remains to be seen, in height of fashion, winning a dramatic Loopy Stakes. From all of us here, a very good afternoon.
In a few moments here on BBC2, a special news programme covering this afternoon's debate in the Commons on the Falklands crisis. That's News Special in a few moments here on 2. And now a brief look at BBC2's programmes for the early part of this evening, starting at 5:10 with The Great Rebuilding. This Open University production takes a look at how the style and standard of domestic building changed between 1550 and 1660, taking as examples London and the Norfolk town of King's Lynn. Charlie Chaplin is to be found on screen behind the screen at 5:35. And then at 6:05, the Great Egg Race, in which this week's teams quite literally have some time on their hands. The challenge to build a 1-minute ticking clock. At 6:35, there's a special edition of the Earl Grey Whistle Test, a concert recorded earlier this week, featuring Rai Kuda. The programme for young cyclists, Sorry Mate I Didn't See You, is at 7:10, and a summary of the news at 7:35. And at 7:40, another fascinating film of early exploration under the title of Travellers in Time. This week it's from 1912 and records an expedition towards the South Pole. This is BBC2. Now a special news report with Michael Burke.
Good afternoon. The House of Commons has just started its 6th emergency debate on the Falklands Island crisis. It's on a day when war between Britain and Argentina seems closer than ever. The signs from Whitehall are that the UN peace talks have ended in failure, with the two countries rejecting each other's peace proposals. Mrs. Thatcher is on her feet in the House of Commons, and we're going over there now live.
Period by Secretary of State Haig. During that period, my ministerial colleagues and I considered no less than 4 sets of proposals. Although these presented substantial difficulties, we did our best to help Mr. Haig continue his mission until Argentine rejection of his last proposals left him no alternative but to abandon his efforts. The next stage of negotiations was based on proposals originally advanced by President Belaunde of Peru and modified in consultations between him and Mr. Haig. As my right honourable friend informed the House on the 7th of May, Britain was willing to accept these, the fifth set of proposals, for an interim settlement. They could have led to an almost immediate ceasefire. But again, it was Argentina who rejected them. I shall not take up the time of the House with a detailed description of those earlier proposals, partly because they belong to those who devised them, but more importantly, because they are no longer on the negotiating table. Britain is not now committed to them. Since the 6th of May, when it became clear that the United States Peruvian proposals were not acceptable to Argentina, the United Nations Secretary-General, Senor Perez de Cuellar, has been conducting negotiations with Britain and Argentina. Following several rounds of discussions, the United Kingdom representative at the United Nations was summoned to London for consultation last Sunday. On Monday, Sir Anthony Parsons returned to New York and presented to the Secretary-General a draft interim agreement between Britain and Argentina, which set out the British position in full. He made clear that the text represented the furthest that Britain could go in the negotiations. He requested that the draft should be transmitted to the Argentine representative and that he should be asked to convey his government's response within 2 days. Yesterday, we received the Argentine government's reply. As I have said, it amounted to a rejection of our own proposals, and we have so informed the Secretary-General. This morning, we have received proposals from the Secretary-General himself. It will help the House to understand the present position if I now describe briefly these 3 sets of proposals. I deal first with our own proposals. These preserve the fundamental principles which are the basis of the government's position. Aggression must not be allowed to succeed. International law must be upheld. Sovereignty cannot be changed by invasion. And the liberty of the Falkland Islanders must be restored. For years, they've been free to express their own wishes about how they want to be governed. They've had institutions of their own choosing. They've enjoyed self-determination. Why should they lose that freedom and exchange it for dictatorship? Mr. Speaker, our proposals are contained in 2 documents. First and mainly, there's the draft interim agreement between ourselves and Argentina. Second, a letter to the Secretary-General, which makes it clear that the British government does not regard the draft interim agreement as covering the dependencies of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. Now, I deal with the dependencies first. South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands are geographically distant from the Falkland Islands themselves. They've no settled population. British title to them does not derive from the Falkland Islands, but is separate. These territories have been treated as dependencies of the Falkland Islands only for reasons of administrative convenience. That's why they are outside the draft agreement. The House has before it the draft agreement, and I turn now to its main features. Article 2 provides for the cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Argentine and British forces from the island and their surrounding waters within 14 days. At the end of the withdrawal, British ships would be at least 150 nautical miles from the islands. Withdrawal much beyond this would not have been reasonable because the proximity of the Argentinian mainland would have given their forces undue advantage. Mr. Speaker, withdrawal of the Argentinian forces would be the most immediate and explicit sign that their government's aggression had failed and that they were being made to give up what they had gained by force. It is the essential beginning of a peaceful settlement and the imperative of Resolution 502. Article 6 sets out the interim arrangements under which the islands would be administered in the period between the cessation of hostilities and the conclusion of negotiations on the long-term future of the islands. In this interim period, there would be a United Nations administrator appointed by the Secretary-General and acceptable to Britain and the Argentine. He would be the officer administering the government. Under Clause 3 of this article, he he would exercise his powers in conformity with the laws and practices traditionally obtaining in the islands. He would consult the islands' representative institutions, that is, the legislative and executive councils through which the islanders were governed until the 2nd of April. There would be, in addition to each of the two councils, of one representative of the 20 or 30 Argentines normally resident in the islands. Their representatives would be nominated by the administrator. Mr. Speaker, this clause has been carefully drawn so that the interim administration cannot make changes in the law and customs of the islanders that would prejudge the outcome of the negotiations on a long-term settlement. This provision would not only go a long way to giving back to the Falklanders the way of life they have always enjoyed, but would prevent an influx of Argentine settlers in the interim period, whose residence would change the nature of society there and radically affect the future of the islands. That would not have been a true interim administration. It would have been an instrument of change. Clause 3 of this article thus fully safeguards the future of the islands. Nothing in this interim administration would compromise the eventual status of the Falklands or the freedom which they have enjoyed for so long. Clause 4 of Article 6 would require the administrator to verify the withdrawal of all forces from the islands and to prevent their reintroduction. I give way for a moment to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Mr. Jack Ashley.
I'm most grateful. Could the Prime Minister just help the House by clarifying one point? She said on the Jimmy Young radio programme the other day that she did not like the word veto as applied to the Falkland Islands. Is the government's present position that the Falkland Islanders will be consulted or that their views are still paramount? Could she help on that?
Mr. Speaker, I am dealing with the arrangements for the interim between the cessation of hostilities and the negotiations. The Right Honourable Gentleman will notice that we have imported into this agreement Article 73, which refers to the paramountcy of the interests of the islanders. Of course, during the long-term negotiations, we should closely consult the wishes of the islanders, and of course, we believe in self-determination. That relates to the long-term negotiations. These articles are dealing with the interim administration, and I've been trying to make clear that the interim administration must not have provisions within it which in effect preempt the outcome of the long-term negotiations. Mr. Speaker, if I might just return to Clause 4 of Article 6, we think it likely that the administrator would need to call upon the help of 3 or 4 countries, other than ourselves and the Argentines, to provide him with the necessary equipment and a small but effective force. The purpose of that is that if our troops leave the islands, we must have some way of guarding against another Argentinian invasion, and the safest way under these arrangements, we thought, would be for the United Nations administrator to have a small United Nations force at his disposal of the kind which I have described. Mr. Speaker, Articles 8 and 9 are also very important. They deal with negotiations between Britain and Argentina on the long-term future of the islands. The key sentence is the one which reads, "These negotiations shall be initiated without prejudice to the rights, claims and positions of the parties and without prejudgment of the outcome." We should thus be free to take fully into account the wishes of the islanders themselves, and Argentina would not be able to claim that the negotiations had to end with a conclusion that suited her. But we...
Prime Minister giving way to Alex Lyon, Labour MP.
Surely it's implicit in those words that if the rights and claims of the Argentinians are being considered, that the outcome of the negotiations may well be that we would cede sovereignty to Argentina.
What I have said is that we do not prejudge the outcome if the wishes of the islanders were to go to Argentina, I believe that this country would uphold the wishes of the islanders. I doubt very much indeed whether the wishes of the islanders after their experience will be anything near that particular wish. Indeed, I believe that they would recoil from it. Now, we are on Article 9. We have to recognize that the negotiations might be lengthy. And that's why Article 9 provides that until the final agreement had been reached and implemented, the interim agreement would remain in force. Mr. Speaker, although this interim agreement does not restore things fully to what they were before the Argentinian invasion, it is faithful to the fundamental principles I outlined earlier. Had the Argentines accepted our proposals, we should have achieved the great prize of preventing further loss of life. And it was with this in mind that we were prepared to make practical changes that were reasonable, but we were not prepared to compromise on principle. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the Argentinian response. This revived once again all the points which had been obstacles in earlier negotiations. Their draft interim agreement applied not only to the Falklands, but included South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands as well. They demanded that all forces should withdraw, including our forces on South Georgia, and return to their normal bases and areas of operation. This was plainly calculated to put us at an enormous disadvantage. They required that the interim administration should be the exclusive responsibility of the United Nations, which should take over all executive, legislative, judicial, and security functions in the islands. They rejected any role for the islands' democratic institutions. They envisaged that the interim administration would appoint as advisors equal numbers of British and Argentine residents of the islands, despite their huge disparity. They required freedom of movement and equality of access with regard to residence, work, and property for Argentine nationals on an equal basis with the Falkland Islanders. The junta's clear aim was to flood the islands with their own nationals during the interim period and thereby change the nature of Falkland society and so prejudge the future of the islands. With regard to negotiations for a long-term settlement, while pretending not to prejudice the outcome, they stipulated that the object was to comply not only with the Charter of the United Nations, but with various resolutions of the General Assembly, from some of which the United Kingdom dissented on the grounds that they favored Argentine sovereignty. And if the period provided for the completion of the negotiation expired, they demanded that the General Assembly should determine the lines to which final agreement should conform. Mr. Speaker, it was manifestly impossible for Britain to accept such demands.
Most of those cheers coming from the Conservative benches.
Argentina began this crisis. Argentina has rejected proposal after proposal. One is bound to ask whether the junta have ever intended to seek a peaceful settlement, or whether they have sought merely to confuse and prolong the negotiations while remaining in illegal possession of the islands. I believe that if we had a dozen more negotiations, the tactics and the results would be the same. From the course of these negotiations and Argentina's persistent refusal to accept Resolution 502, we are bound to conclude that her objective is procrastination and continuing occupation, leading eventually to sovereignty.
John Biggs Davidson.
I'm sorry to interrupt her, but do we understand that the proposed interim agreement, like some earlier proposals, is no longer on the table, having regard to the fact that provisions, also proposed provisions, for the withdrawal of British forces and a non-British administration have consequences for British sovereignty and for the principles for which the task force was dispatched.
He's a vice chairman of the Conservative Backbench Foreign Affairs Committee.
Have been rejected. They are no longer on the table. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the Secretary-General has this morning put to us and to Argentina an aide-memoire describing those issues where, in his opinion, agreement seemed to exist and those on which differences remain. The first group of issues, those where he believes there is a measure of agreement, would require further clarification, for on some points our interpretation would be different. The aide-memoire states, for example, that Argentina would accept long-term negotiations without prejudgment of the outcome. This important phrase was, however, omitted from the Argentine response to our own proposals and is belied by a succession of statements from Buenos Aires. Those points where, in the Secretary-General's judgment, differences remain include, first, aspects of the interim administration; second, the timetable for completion of negotiations and the related duration of the interim administration; third, aspects of the mutual withdrawal of forces; fourth, the geographic area to be covered. Senor Perez de Cuellar has proposed formulations to cover some of these points. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary-General, to whose efforts I pay tribute, has a duty to continue to seek agreement. But as our representative is telling him in New York, his paper differs in certain important respects from our position as presented to him on the 17th of May, and which we then described as the furthest we could go. Moreover, it differs fundamentally from the present Argentine position as communicated to us yesterday. It is not a draft agreement, but as the Secretary-General himself puts it, it is a number of formulations and suggestions. Some of his suggestions are the very ones which have already been rejected by the Argentine response to our own proposals. Even if they were acceptable to both parties as a basis for negotiation, that negotiation would take many days, if not weeks, to reach either success or failure. Mr. Speaker, we've been through this often before, and each time have been met with Argentine obduracy and procrastination. Argentina rejected our proposals. It is inconceivable that they would now come genuinely to accept those of the Secretary-General's ideas which closely resemble our own. Even if we were...
I'm very grateful to the
Guy Barnett, Labour MP.
Is she aware that according to the Quaker mission at the United Nations in New York, certain members of the Security Council have prepared a document which is thought may be the basis for negotiation between ourselves and the Argentine?
No, sir, and I think that that is covered by what I have already said. These are the 7th set of proposals we have considered. We have considered them carefully. Each time we've met with tactics whose object is procrastination, leading to continued occupation of the islands. It was because of that, the record on this, that we thought it best to put up our own specific draft interim agreement in writing, so that our position was totally clear for the world to see. Totally clear to see that we were not compromising fundamental principles, but we were prepared to make some reasonable practical suggestions if we could secure the prize of no further loss of life. Those were rejected. They are no longer on the table. No, not at the moment, because the Honourable Gentleman is interrupting the flow of what I'm saying. What is being considered now is something which is called an aide-memoire, which is not a draft agreement, but are clear, is that they are those which have already been rejected by the Argentinian response to our proposals. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Grateful to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Why have we withdrawn these proposals, even though they've been rejected by Argentina? Why can't we, right up until the last minute, why can't they stay on the table for acceptance by
Another Labour MP, Geoffrey Robbins.
Because they have been rejected, and it's the 7th lot of proposals with which we've been involved. They really cannot go on and on. Someone has to make a decision and an assessment of the objectives of the Argentine junta. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Leo Abse.
Since at the end of the day, every rational man and woman knows that we cannot sustain indefinitely the sovereignty of those rocks 8,000 miles away. Why is the Prime Minister showing such extraordinary impatience that she will not continue to seek to negotiate when the alternative is carnage and blood, which will have no good effect at all?
Because the Argentines do not want a negotiated settlement. They want sovereignty of the islands and are using protracted negotiations in order to procure that objective. And I do not believe they are genuine in their negotiations. No, I think I really must.
Prime Minister giving way to Dr. David Owen from the Social Democratic Party.
Prime Minister accept that there are many people who would believe that the proposals put forward by the British government are fair proposals. But there are many people who would recognise that the British government may now feel it necessary to take further military measures. But they could not necessarily understand why the Prime Minister feels it necessary to withdraw those proposals, and why those proposals cannot still be on the table and held on the table in the hope that the Argentinian government would eventually come to their senses.
It seems to me perfectly clear that if the proposals have been rejected, it is reasonable to withdraw them. What we are now considering, it is reasonable to withdraw them. They have been rejected. They are no longer on the table. What we are now considering is an aide-memoire put up by the Secretary-General. And it seems to me perfectly right. If you make an offer and it's rejected, that is an end of the matter, particularly bearing in mind that those are the 7th set of proposals which I have, in fact, been involved with. Mr. Speaker, even if we were prepared to negotiate on the basis of the aide-memoire, we should first wish to see substantive Argentine comments on it, going beyond mere acceptance of it as a basis for negotiation. These are the points we are making in our reply to the Secretary-General. At the same time, we are reminding him, as my right honourable friends and I have repeatedly said to the House, the negotiations do not close any military options. Mr. Speaker, the gravity of the situation will be apparent to the House and the nation. Difficult days lie ahead, but Britain will face them in the conviction that our cause is just, and in the knowledge that we have been doing everything reasonable to secure a negotiated settlement. The principles we are defending are fundamental to everything that this Parliament and this country stand for. They are the principles of democracy and the rule of law. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in violation of the rights of peoples to determine by whom and in what way they are governed. Its aggression was committed against a people who are used to enjoying full human rights and freedom. It was executed by a government with a notorious record in suspending and violating those same rights. Britain has the responsibility towards the islanders to restore their democratic way of life. She has a duty to the whole world to show that aggression will not succeed and to uphold the cause of freedom.
Prime Minister sitting down there, having accused Argentina of obduracy, delay, deception and bad faith.
Mr. Speaker, may I first of all say that I believe that it has been for the benefit of the House and the country as a whole, not only to have this debate at this moment, but also to have before the House, in preparation for this debate, the documents which the government has presented about the last period of the negotiations which have occurred. But I would like to underline to the government that I hope very much that they will provide at a very early date also a larger document. There is the documents concerned with the Peruvian proposals. There are the documents concerned with the proposals made by Secretary of State Haig, and I believe that the House of Commons and the country has the right to have all those propositions before it. Indeed, I think the House can see from what has happened here today how absurd it would have been if we had proceeded with this debate without having the latest proposals which the government has had published in preparation for the debate, albeit at a fairly short notice. May I say to the Right Honourable Lady also that I will certainly, of course, comment upon what the government has said in that document, and comment in particular upon the latest remarks that she has made about the Secretary-General's proposals. And in some respects, in my opinion, that is the most important aspect of this particular debate, and I certainly will return to it in a moment. But I hope, in preparation for what I may wish to say on that subject on behalf of the opposition, there are one or two preliminary matters that are of some importance that I would like to underline afresh. I don't claim that they are novel in any sense whatsoever, but I do believe that it is important that we should have them clearly understood. First of all, I would refer again to the debate we had on April the 3rd. I know there have been some people who say that the House of Commons reacted in a spirit of impetuosity, or however it may be described, in that earlier debate. But I think there was a very good grounds for what was done. I believe that what was expressed by the House of Commons in that debate on April the 3rd was the feeling of moral outrage about what had occurred, and I believe also that the House of Commons was right then to underline its concern with the Falkland Islanders, because after all they were the people who were most afflicted and who had least possible accusation that could be made against them. They were leading their lives perfectly innocently. They weren't interfering with anybody else, and it was the interference with their rights that, of course, gave rise to that feeling in that debate on April the 3rd. And I don't believe that the House of Commons needs to apologise for that in any sense whatsoever. However, we are concerned also not only about the rights of the Falkland Islanders, but also their lives. And we have to take that into account, and what may be the kind of protection that we can best afford them. Now let me refer also to another matter which, of course, became prominent in our debate on April the 3rd, even though we did not at that moment know the exact outcome, and that is Resolution 502, which has been the sheet anchor of the British case on this matter throughout the world, throughout the whole of this period. I believe the passage of that resolution was a matter of major importance, and I believe that the allegiance of this House to that resolution has been of major importance, and it has been the guide that we have had throughout all these difficulties. I do not believe it would have been possible for us to proceed without some such resolution as that, and I remind the House and remind everyone in the House that I think in one form or another, every member of this House has given his support to that Resolution 502, and I believe that it is important that that should be reiterated, because it was primarily on the basis of that resolution that we were able to command support for the British case throughout the world, and I believe that that was important that we should insist upon it. Indeed, I don't claim any precedence in the matter, but we on this side of the House do attach the very greatest importance to upholding the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations organization. And I believe that this crisis itself is a proof of the fact that if we didn't have a United Nations Charter, we'd have to invent one. If we didn't have a United Nations organization, we'd have to invent one. If we didn't have a Secretary General who could assist us in these matters, we would have to... Oh, well, I'm interested that we'll come very clearly to that matter in a moment about the Secretary General, and I hope there aren't going to be any derision from any quarter of this House on that. It's certainly any such derision is repudiated on this side of the House, and I would have hoped it would have been repudiated. I'm sure it's repudiated by the Foreign Secretary, but I will come to that in a moment. But I underline this afresh because I believe that in this crisis it has been of enormous importance for this country that our allegiance to the United Nations Charter and the organization should be upheld, and indeed that is the bedrock of our policy in this matter. Now, I also may say and underline, I know there may be some differences on this point, but I underline afresh the view I have held on it throughout. I believe that in support of the action under Resolution 502, I think it was necessary for the government to send the task force, and in the debate on April the 14th, I gave the reasons why I held that view, and I still hold that view today. That task force, of course, it's of absolute importance that it should be under political control, and the Right Honourable Lady has constantly reiterated to us that that is the case, and of course it must always be the case, especially if in fact there is to be over these coming days an escalation of the military action itself. If our troops are sent into further military action, escalating action, whatever it may be, if they are, I'm sure it is the desire of everyone in this House that the action should be as swift and successful as possible. And we say that, and I said it at the time of the recovery of South Georgia, and I say it again now because I believe it is of importance that it should be said. The Right Honourable Lady sometimes refers to our boys. She sometimes refers to our boys as if they are her boys, but they're not exactly her boys. No. And she sometimes... She sometimes refers to these matters in that way. But I say that I wish what we have to deal with is the question of our ministers and the responsibility of our ministers, and we are perfectly entitled to make all the demands we wish in that respect. But the government has had, in sustaining the rights of this country, the fullest support from the opposition, and I don't believe that anybody could make any complaint upon that score. But I come now to some of the doubts and legitimate doubts and anxieties which intelligent people in this country have argued about during the whole of this period. Right from the beginning, right from those early days in April, right from then, indeed, the more the time has elapsed, right from then it has become evident that it is incomparably better that this dispute should be settled, if possible, by peaceful means. And when I use the expression incomparably better, I mean exactly that. There is such a whole long list of factors that can be cited that illustrate how much greater it would be the advantage if we could have a peaceful settlement. There are, first of all, the obvious factors, I'm sure is agreed by everybody in all sections of the House, about the dangers to the loss of life, our own manpower, our own people, the Argentinians, and the Falkland Islanders themselves. Their lives might all be involved, and therefore that is the first reason why it is so important that we should seek a peaceful settlement of this dispute, and why we have emphasized it throughout the whole of this period. But there are some other reasons as well, as the government knows, and as we have mentioned in the debates, particularly my right honourable friend, the member from Leeds. It is possible that if in fact there were certain actions taken which I do not intend to describe now, but all of us can understand them, it is possible that we could lose some of the backing which we have in some of the other parts of the world. And for the government, I don't believe the government would neglect such a possibility or such a development. It could occur. I don't want it to occur. Indeed, we've got to ensure that action shall be taken that it does not occur. But it is one of the factors in the situation. There is the geography of the matter, the diplomatic history of the matter, all the other developments which were discussed, many of the other developments which were discussed in the debate last Thursday. They cannot all be pushed aside by an impatient backbenchers on that side of the House. And indeed, if anyone looks to the way in which the debate has been conducted throughout the country, I do believe that some special credit should go to those elements in the discussion, those newspapers, which have sought to withstand the hysteria and the stupidity that has been spread in some quarters. I believe that all honor should go to those newspapers, The Guardian, the Daily Mirror, the Financial Times, the Observer and the Sunday Times, that have withstood the hysterical nonsense we've had from so many others. And I think it has been well for the reputation of this country, as well as also advantageous for the attempt to secure a peace. It has been good for both those purposes that those arguments should have been sustained. Now I come to the document which the Right Honourable Lady and the government have presented to us.
Mr. Mark Leonard Boyd, Conservative MP.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, could he take the opportunity at this stage, at the outset of his remarks now, to indicate whether he feels the British government should have offered more than was contained in these proposals?
I'm coming to these matters, and of course I am, and I indicated at the beginning of my remarks I was doing so, but I think it was perfectly right that I should put them in the context that I have done, and I certainly do not intend to be dissuaded from that purpose by the Right Honourable Gentleman. Of course I will answer it. Of course I will answer it. The Right Honourable Lady and the government have presented the terms of their document to us, and I must say, and I've read the document since receiving it earlier today, I believe that it does present a clear and formidable case, and anybody who would claim differently, I think, would not be reading it intelligently. It does, in my opinion, show not only that the government has stated clearly the principles on which they have acted, the principles of democracy and self-determination. They've restated those principles in the document. They have also indicated some matters on which they have been prepared, I don't say to compromise, but at any rate to make proposals which they believed would help towards a settlement. And I believe it is important that that should be underlined too, particularly when the accusation is made in some quarters that the government has been solely intransigent on the matter. That is the case that is made in Buenos Aires, and I believe that the refutation of that case, which is in this document, is a matter of value for the present situation and for the future. I believe that most of the proposals, certainly if the government could secure a settlement on the basis of they have proposed, if the government could secure a settlement on that basis, certainly we in the opposition would be very gratified, and indeed I believe the country would be gratified and the world would be gratified. I believe that they are fair proposals, and I believe that it is right that they should have been presented in those terms. But I also say to the government, yes, because you can't get a peace by just roaring in the House of Commons, you know. We could have had a peace long ago if that was the simple way of getting it. There's much more important issues involved, and those who've been engaged in these matters will understand that much better. No, there are some other factors, however, in the government's own statement that I believe that have to be considered. The Right Honourable Lady says that the Argentine proposals, and certainly there are many defects in those proposals, to some of which she drew very properly underlined and drew attention. Of course, there are many of their proposals that are deeply objectionable to this country. There's not the slightest doubt about that. I can cite some of them, don't need to cite them all. The one about South Georgia, for example, is an extremely difficult proposition, and one that I, of course, in this country would find it impossible to accept. And there are other proposals of that nature too. But when the Right Honourable Lady says that what the Argentine proposals, as outlined in her own white paper, what they amount to is a total rejection of all proposals, I don't believe that that is the case. I don't believe that that is the case, and indeed, I don't believe the Foreign Secretary would claim it, because in the debate we had last Thursday, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Foreign Secretary, did underline that he suggested, I'm not convicting him of anything, he did suggest that there had been some movement towards the acceptance of two essential requirements that the British government was insisting upon rightly, right from the beginning. First of all, the requirement about withdrawal, and secondly, the requirement about no preconditions about the eventual discussions that were to take place. Now, in this document, I'm not saying that what they propose on those two items is adequate in any sense at all, but to say that it is a total rejection on those grounds doesn't seem to me to be an accurate account of the whole state of affairs. However, the Right Honourable Lady, and here we come, in my opinion, to the most important aspect of her speech altogether. The Right Honourable Lady says, we've had dozens of these proposals, where we've been 7, yes? No, she says we've been at this time a dozen before, but a 7 at any rate. 7's quite enough. 7. And then she says, someone has to make an assessment. That's quite right. But, you know, it isn't only a question of this government making the assessment or the assessment being made in this country. It's also a question of an assessment being made by some others. And amongst those who are entitled to make an assessment on how we are going to get peace or war in this matter is the Secretary-General of the United Nations. And nobody could be more determined to ensure that than the Right Honourable Lady, because she has been saying it. And if any of her honourable friends do not back her in this, they can indicate it. But the Right Honourable Lady has been most forthcoming on the subject. She said at the beginning of the week, in her response to questions about when it was said, we've been at this for 6 weeks, and we're having one last go to see if we can get a peaceful settlement. And then the questioner on the programme said, how long can that last go on for? Days, hours, weeks? And the Right Honourable Lady said, well, it occurs through the Secretary-General of the United Nations, who is being very, very active indeed, a person of total integrity, and it just depends how long he thinks he can go on. So that's one answer from the Right Honourable Lady. Then she gave another answer yesterday about the Secretary-General, she said, and United Nations administration, I believe, would be carried on with great integrity. She was referring to the possibilities of the interim administration. United Nations administration, I believe, would be carried on out with great integrity. I think that we are all lucky to have Mr. Duquela as Secretary-General. He is a person himself of great integrity, and we have a special relationship with him because he was head of the United Nations observers at the elections in Rhodesia. And then she went on, so he knows how we bring colonies to independence. He knows how we arrange things with free elections. He knows that we believe in self-determination. And he has seen us at it. So we have a special faith in him. And at the beginning of this week, I also put it to the Right Honourable Lady, one of the reasons why I requested that we should have this debate and have the documents was that it might be not merely that the government would, the House of Commons would demand the right to judge the terms itself, but it would also be the case, might be, I said in the letter I sent to her on Monday, that the Secretary-General himself might come forward with proposals at the end to be put to both sides. And I said on Monday that I thought it would be intolerable if in such a situation as that, when proposals were coming from the Secretary-General, who after all knows as much about the intricacies of the negotiation as anybody, that if we were to go ahead with a great escalation of the conflict without having the chance to judge what the Secretary-General might be proposing at the end of these discussions. And
I mean, if he had been Prime Minister, having, as he did in his...
Robert Adley, Conservative MP.
...approved the sending of the task force, is he now suggesting that the British Prime Minister should hand over to the Secretary-General of the United Nations the timing of future negotiations, regardless of their outcome? Because I think that's something which many of us would find extremely hard to accept.
I'm not saying that we hand it over regardless of their outcome or regardless of the time. But I do say, and particularly because the Right Honourable Lady herself has insisted on a number of occasions that there has been no hold-up in the military operations because of the discussions. She's nodding her head now, and of course she's said it many times. There has been no hold-up in the military operations because of discussions up to this point. So it isn't a question of asking for a great deal of time. It is asking for a proper response to what the Secretary-General has had to say. Now, one of the disputes I had with the Right Honourable Lady at an earlier time in the proceedings some 3 weeks ago was when the Secretary-General came forward with some suggestions then before the Foreign Secretary had had any meetings with him, and we urged from this side of the House that, of course, it would be improper for us to proceed without having the fullest possible discussions with the Secretary-General. Now, that has been repaired in the sense that the Foreign Secretary has been and had discussions with the Secretary-General. But now we have reached the point at which the breakdown has occurred in the other negotiations, but the Secretary-General himself believes that the matter is of such supreme importance that he is entitled, in the words of the Right Honourable Lady, she says, someone has to make an assessment. Well, the Secretary-General has got as much right to make an assessment as the Prime Minister and as anybody else. And the Secretary-General on these matters may be listened to in many parts of the world on this subject, and we will need the support of many other countries if we are going to command. And I say this further because I believe it was a great mistake for the Right Honourable Lady to say that, and I don't suppose it will govern her conduct in future negotiations, but I think it was a great mistake on the Right Honourable Lady's part to say that all the proposals that she and her government had made in the past are now withdrawn. Yes. Because what is the position of the Secretary-General? Why not, says the honourable member opposite. I'll say why not, because we want the Secretary-General to succeed. Yes. We want to give him every support in succeeding. And we want to ensure that the government will give every proper response to the Secretary-General. I say, yes, I do. And I will make a specific proposal to the Right Honourable Lady on the subject in a few minutes. It is no use, honourable members in this House, pushing it aside and to say we will have nothing to do with what the Secretary-General is going to propose. Right. Now we're making some improvement.
Mrs. Thatcher getting up, standing at the dispatch box.
I think the Right Honourable Gentleman can't have heard quite what I said. The Secretary-General has put forward an aide-memoire. I described it. I described what we were saying to him, and I said that what we are saying to him could not foreclose any military options any more than it has in the past. There is his aide-memoire. I don't understand the Right Honourable Gentleman's point.
If the Right Honourable Lady is now telling us that her response to the Secretary-General is what raucous backbenchers would support her, but that's another matter. But I say to the Right Honourable Lady, particularly at such a delicate moment as this, and particularly when the command of the support throughout the world is of paramount importance for this country in the weeks and months ahead, I say to the Right Honourable Lady and to the government that I hope that they will build on the answer that she's just given. I hope they will build on the response they've already made about the Secretary-General, and I hope they will carry it much further. And I hope that before they take any further action, they will make a much bigger response. Indeed, I believe the right. Indeed, I know that the party opposite has tried to brush aside the Secretary-General on previous occasions. Oh, yes. But they've had to come back to it in the end. I say that the proper course for the Right Honourable Lady and the Foreign Secretary is tonight or tomorrow to go to New York and to discuss the matter with the Secretary-General. I say that that is the proper way in which such discussion should be carried through, and I say that the Right Honourable Lady, if she wants to command support in this situation, what she needs to do is to command support throughout the United Nations organisation itself, and that means to say sustaining the Secretary-General in the propositions he's put to the British government today.
Leader of the Opposition sitting down, having made that plea for Mrs. Thatcher or Mr. Pym to go to New York.
The opening speeches there in this latest Commons debate on the Falklands crisis. The debate's due to go on for some time yet, but Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Foote have set out their views on this latest stage of developments. Keith Graves, our diplomatic correspondent, has been listening to that debate. What was your impression of what the two party leaders said?
I think it quite clearly showed, and Mrs Thatcher was stating it officially now in the Commons, what we've all known for some time, which is that the two sides are very, very, very far apart, and there was very little chance of them ever coming together. I also think it was a clear answer by Mrs Thatcher to those who accused her a week ago of a sellout. It was obvious that she was prepared to make a compromise, but I don't think there was ever any question in her mind of a sellout. She was going to stand by the principles that she set out, and that's what she's done.
Keith, the basis of the negotiations between Britain and Argentina over the past few months have rather unusually been published today by the British government. From them and what you've heard Mrs Thatcher in particular saying, has either side been prepared to make any concessions during this whole process of negotiations?
Well, we have. I mean, it may sound a little bit jingoistic. We have. They haven't. That's what it amounts to. We were prepared, for example, to allow a UN administration onto the island, whereas originally we said we wanted to restore a British administration. Now we were prepared to run it under a United Nations administration. We were prepared to pull our troops right out, not to put the troops back, not to put Governor Hunt back in. And so we were prepared to make some concessions, but there was never really any chance that the Argentines would be able to accept them.
What's your assessment of the proposals from the UN Secretary-General, Pérez de Cuéllar, and also the reaction to them?
I don't think that they have much of a chance of succeeding, and I think Mrs Thatcher hinted as much. She said that if you had 12 more lots of negotiations like we've just had, in other words, if you negotiated for more than another year, you still wouldn't get anywhere. And I think what she was signalling today was that as far as she is concerned, the talking is finished. These latest British proposals, which we've now had published, have been withdrawn. They're no longer on the table, she says. I think that she was quite clearly signalling that the talking is finished and that she is now prepared to give the go-ahead for the military option, and that's what I think she'll do quite soon.
Thank you, Keith. John Cole, our political editor, is in one of our Westminster studios. Well, the peace proposals appear to have been rejected and withdrawn. Is there any faith or any hope in the House of Commons, John, for the initiative from Mr Pérez de Cuéllar?
Well, I don't think Mrs Thatcher has told us enough about that initiative yet to know, but I don't agree with Keith that she is writing an end to the negotiations. Indeed, I think there was a note of exasperation in her voice about the delay. She clearly sees the Argentines conducting these negotiations over a long period in order to retain possession of these islands illegally. But what I think, and the Minister said it to me just before she went into the House, that what the government foresees is a kind of ladder of military activity, which would be a background to further negotiations. And I think the tone of Mrs Thatcher was that she will continue to explore anything the Secretary-General of the United Nations has to offer, without any very great hope, but always in the knowledge that she wants to keep world opinion with her. And I thought she was signalling that, as well as making the reservation, which she has made consistently during the dispute, that she won't allow whatever military action the British government thinks appropriate to be delayed because negotiations are taking place. But I don't think she was signalling necessarily a full-time invasion, and that's certainly the guidance one's hearing elsewhere in Whitehall.
What is the mood at Westminster now? There'll be a division at the end of this debate. Will that illustrate a division in political thinking amongst MPs?
Well, it's very hard to say how that division will go. It's being forced by people on the Labour backbenches. The tone of Mr Foot's speech, I thought, was supportive of the task force, certainly, supportive of what the government has so far, and I agree very much with Keith here. The concessions the government has made clearly have made a great impression on the House of Commons, including Mr Foot and the opposition front bench. So they will not vote against the government. But it was notable that both Mr Foot and Dr David Owen, in that intervention in Mrs Thatcher's speech, were appealing to her not to withdraw the concessions that Britain has made, the compromise proposals that we've made about interim settlement and so on, which have gone a long way and look like a bridging operation. Clearly the Argentines have to move a long way yet. I would suspect that South Georgia, frankly, was only a negotiating ploy on their part. They can't really seriously believe that British forces are going to be withdrawn from South Georgia as part of this deal.
John, finally and very briefly, most of the country appears to think some sort of invasion is imminent over the next few hours. Is that what MPs think?
No, I don't think most of the country thinks it. I think a lot of the headline writers in Fleet Street think it. I think more military action is inevitable. Most people at the House of Commons think that, but I don't think they necessarily think that it'll be a full-scale invasion. But no one can be quite sure of that. It may well be that all this is a cover-up for the preparation of military action, so that our troops won't be put in danger by the Argentines realising what's happening in advance.
John Cole, thanks very much indeed. The debate in the Commons will be going on throughout the evening. Richard Baker will be bringing you the latest on that and any further developments in the Falkland crisis, together with today's other main news stories, in our scheduled early evening news on BBC1 at 5:40.
Well, the time now is almost 19 minutes to 5. And until the great rebuilding, the Open University programme at 5:10, BBC2 is returning to a trade test transmission.